Okay, I believe we're ready to get going with our next session. We have Why and How to Start Using ARIA Tags by Penny Kronz. Thank you, Penny. Take it away.
Sure. So just a little quick introduction to myself. Hit start so I keep track of time. I have done web consulting for higher education for approximately the last 10 years. I worked for a content management system, so my responsibilities there were helping to implement different designs that were provided by design vendors and having our tool automatically include the necessary background tags that were built into the design to make sure that as people enter content into the website, that it would take full use of the different functionality and capabilities of HTML and ARIA more recently. I now work at DubBot doing accessibility automated testing and helping to create training videos and give guidance to what the actual issues being reported on pages are, and also to give people additional direction on what else they can be doing with regard to accessibility. Before doing consulting for higher education, I worked for the state government. So I've been on both sides, the private and the public sector. At the state, I was responsible for managing emergency alerts. I had to carry around a brick, that we called it the brick. It was a big phone back before phones were small. And I had to keep the dark pages. And if and when something happened, I would be called to bring up the dark pages. So just a little bit of background on myself. So I really like talking about accessibility. I like talking about emergency alerts and how to best maintain that on websites. So if you guys want to talk to me afterwards about any of that stuff, you have a little bit of background on me and where I come from on those sort of things. It's been about 1.5 years since I've done public speaking, so I'm a little nervous. I hope that you guys take at least one thing away from this session. I was in the previous session with Rachel, so some of this is going to be a repeat, but hopefully I'm going into more depth on what the ARIA tags are and where to start using them. So a quick history about ARIA. I'm Southern, so sometimes I slip and say area, and everybody's like, ARIA. And I'm like, yes, I know, but pecan or pecan. The main three technologies behind the web are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Originally, HTML was pretty straightforward with only 18 elements. Web pages were pretty static. As HTML evolved over time, so did CSS and JavaScript, and more web pages are acting more like mini applications, where content isn't just staying on the page, it's changing, and we have to be able to provide information to screen readers about what is changing, and also give a little more context of how that HTML is being used. WAI ARIA is also, you'll see those letters thrown before it. WAI is for Web Accessibility Initiative. The ARIA standards are being constantly updated by the W3C. In fact, if you go to their website, you'll see that there's a draft version available that you can see that they're still adopting new suggestions. I don't recommend beginners start there. There is a wealth of information on that website, and I don't think it's the most organized for somebody that's just trying to jump in and start figuring their way around. I will provide a couple links to some tutorials that I've found helpful from learning ARIA myself. So why use ARIA? ARIA can be used to make your website more accessible. Good semantic HTML improves the accessibility of web pages. The goal is not to always have to use ARIA. If you can use HTML elements, as Rachel suggested, your best bet is to use the HTML. ARIA should be used to provide additional context where you can add in additional information for screen readers. Adding ARIA tags shouldn't affect the render of the page for sighted visitors. It should really be for people using a screen reader to give that screen reader additional context. Reasons that you would definitely want to consider adding ARIA tags to your website would be if you have the content on the page changing, or if there's a state of something expanding. If there's a state of something expanding on the website, that would be useful to be able to alert the screen reader to tell its visitor that something has changed. Also, if you're using, maybe outdated HTML, it might be a good stopgap until you do a redesign to use better HTML. Not necessarily saying that, the HTML was done wrong, but we've all been in the place where you have turnover and things were done in a way that, there were limits back, 5 years ago of how you developed something. So maybe your predecessor did something the way that it was, expected back then, but now there's better ways of doing it, but maybe you don't have time to go through a full redesign. So you can use ARIA and incorporate that into your existing HTML to give more context to what's going on and to make use of some of the newer technologies available. So will my web page be accessible if I don't use ARIA? No, not necessarily. It's possible that you could make your web page more accessible. Accessibility is not a black and white thing. It's a sliding scale, in my opinion. Lots of different shades of gray. So ARIA can be used to make things better. There's not really any drawbacks to adding ARIA as long as you do it correctly. So I would suggest before you deploy certain ARIA tags that you make sure you fully understand them. Because there are, and I'll talk about one specific case that you will want to check your website and make sure you're avoiding it, where if you're a novice, it's could cause the keyboard shortcuts that are natural to web visitors not to be able to be used. So we'll get into that in a little bit. So ARIA basics, the three main terminologies you should know after this presentation are roles, properties, and states. Roles are attributes on HTML, and properties and states are what are often referred to as the ARIA attributes. Roles, they will not change once they are defined within the source of the page. They'll always be lowercase. So that's one thing that I always pick up on when our tool reports a role that is incorrectly used. It's a lot of times somebody's capitalized something. If you see capitalization in any of the roles, there's something off. So it could be just a simple, making sure everything's lowercase, and that could be your talking point, or just something you take away from this presentation is that roles are always lowercase. So if you see something that's not lowercase, it's not implemented correctly. There are 4 types of ARIA roles. I'm going to talk about 3 of them today. There are landmark roles, there are document structure roles, there are widget roles, and there are abstract roles. If you're a beginner, you don't need to worry about what abstract roles are. Abstract roles are for application development. You will want to start learning about landmark and widget roles first, most likely. Document structure roles, those are typically better handled with native HTML, and I'll show you some examples of those in a little bit. But landmark roles, this is like the low-hanging fruit. This is the easy place to start. If you were in the last presentation with Rachel, she showed a screen reader reading the different regions on the page. That was because they were making use of landmark roles. Landmark roles add functionality for screen readers to navigate between sections of the web page. You can use those little anchor tags that we always put at the top, and then we would add another A link in the content. You don't have to do that anymore. You don't have to add that A jump play location. You can use the landmark role to link from the top of your page to include jumps for keyboard navigators. But screen readers will pick up on the landmarks and give them as options for navigating through content. If you add landmarks to your page, you need to mark up all areas of the page with perceivable content with an appropriate landmark. So it's worth noting, like, when you go to add your landmarks, the first thing you should do is look at your web page and maybe print it out, draw boxes around it, and then you could write on it what landmarks you think those areas should be. And just make sure each area is covered by a landmark. Just because you don't have role equals something doesn't mean you're not already using a landmark. Many HTML5 elements define ARIA landmarks by default. So if you're using HTML5, it's possible that you already have some landmarks within your site. It is important to understand the meaning behind the ARIA roles being associated with HTML5 elements automatically when creating your HTML, so you're not confusing users. And I'll get into this in a moment, but one of the big ones you'll see is header has an associated landmark with it, and footer does as well. But adding an ARIA attribute to an HTML5 element that has ARIA roles built in is redundant. So if you're using an HTML5 element, and I'll have a list of the full ones that have specific meaning behind them, you don't have to add role equals. So these are the common landmark roles that I would encourage everyone to start using if you're not using HTML5 elements that have the same meaning. So role equals banner. This could be a confusing connotation. It doesn't necessarily mean a banner image. Usually your banner area is going to be where your logo is, maybe where your search bar contains your search bar, just that top bar on your website is usually the banner. Role equals navigation. If you're using, and I'll go through this in a minute, if you're using a nav element in HTML5, you don't need to add role equals navigation. But role equals navigation is a great way to be able to provide jumps to people to your different navigations. So whether it be your main site navigation or you have a department navigation, you can have multiple of the same role on a page. But this can give people an easy way to traverse your page, especially if they're using a screen reader. Role equals main. This is this will be where your main content is contained. You will only have one role equals main on your page. That's like the only hard and fast rule there. Role equals complementary. This is usually your sidebars. It can be additional information that's related to the main content. So a lot of people have like news stories, but they'll have related stories section. So that might be a complementary section. And then there's role equals content info. This is going to be like your footer, and actually footer element, which I'll show you in a moment, has content info role built into it. So this would be like your copyright statement or anything that contains your like footer links. Role equals search, as Rachel pointed out, if you weren't in the session. Search, this is a great way to give somebody an easy way to quickly jump to your search menu. There's also role equals form. So if for some reason you're not using a form element, I've seen a lot of cases where people get a search form or a form that they embed and it's using not standard form elements. You might want to add this to the code that you're provided from a third-party service. Role equals region. This is like a complementary, but a little more generic. If you use role equals region, you'll need to provide a label for that region because it's just too generic. And I'll get into labels in a moment. So using a landmark more than once on a page is totally fine. I have up here an example, and ideally I would have used the nav element, but just hypothetically speaking, say you're using an old Bootstrap template that didn't have HTML5 elements like nav. You could have role equals navigation, and here is how an example of how you would provide a label to the navigation so that people would know which navigation it is. I'll get into the difference between area label and area labeled by. But I just wanted to show this example of two different navigation systems with two different labels and two different ways to label them. So these are the HTML5 elements with built-in ARIA roles. You have aside, that is a complementary role. You have footer. If it's directly within the body element, it is treated as content info role. But if it's tucked into something else, that role no longer applies, and you could add a custom role for it. Form, that's another one that if you use the form element, you don't need to add role equals form. Header, if you have the header element, you don't need to add role equals banner. It is a lot like the footer, where if it's not directly within the body element, you should probably add the role that you're intending for it. Main has main, nav has navigation, and section has region. When it has an accessible name using area labeled by or area label. So if you do use section, you should still add that label because it is treated as a generic region. Okay. Sorry, I'm going off the script. So you then have document structure roles. So these are a little more granular. These are the ones that I don't typically think you should be using if you have good HTML. So like you shouldn't have to add role equals list. Hopefully you're using an unordered list. But if for some reason maybe somebody didn't use an unordered list element and you want to create a manual list and add some structure around it, you can use the role equals list. Rachel gave a great example for why you would use role equals image. So in the last presentation, she spoke about how if you're using a div and you apply a background image and maybe you wanted to have like text overlay, in order to provide information about that image, you could add role equals image to that div that has the background image on it, and then you could describe the image using an area label. So that was a good note from her presentation. But yeah, like with row and row group, hopefully if you're presenting tabular information, you're using a table. So these are not like the place I would start as a beginner. Widget roles. Widget roles lack equivalent semantics in HTML, so this is really where you can get deep into using roles within your HTML. They can be used on their own or as part of a larger composite widget. So widgets are really where you're going to be building like custom components within your website. So think about mega menus or that have drop downs or tabs or accordions. A lot of us may get like the tab or accordion code from some source that gives us the JavaScript, and you just plug in the JavaScript and then in the CSS that they give you, and you use the HTML element as they document. You can add ARIA roles to those things. The one thing to note though is with using widget roles, actually that's going to be with ARIA attributes, but when you're developing widgets, the roles are going to be static, and then the states are going to change, and you will have to do some custom programming for that. But actually putting in the widget roles isn't that hard to add that to your HTML that you're given by a third party. So different widget roles that exist are alert, alert dialog, button, checkbox, dialog, grid cell, link, log. You'll see there's a huge list. The ones I see most often in higher education websites are tab panel, and yeah, I think those are the main ones. So abstract roles. Like I said before, these, if you're a beginner, you don't need to concern yourself with. If you're not actually developing an application, you likely don't need to worry about those. So I don't really cover them. I wanted to bring up that there is abstract roles. They're used for actual application development. not used for marking up HTML, so not really relevant to what we're talking about. And they don't provide extra accessibility information to screen readers directly from the HTML. There would have to be a lot of additional programming that happened with them. So properties and states. These are what are most commonly referred to as ARIA attributes. These are what start with ARIA dash. So when you're looking at HTML, if you ever see ARIA dash, you're working with a property or a state. Properties are a lot like roles where they're mostly static when they're set in the HTML. They typically help describe relationships between different elements on the page. There's 38 properties that can be used in ARIA, and properties are divided into 4 categories by the W3C. Currently there are 19 widget properties, 3 live region properties, 1 drag and drop property, and 15 relationship properties. You would most likely be concerned with the widget properties and the relationship properties if you're working on a website. So that leaves us down to 34. Simple enough. So these are the most common ones I see in HTML, and these are the easiest places to start using them within HTML. So there's no harm in going in and adding labels appropriately. And you don't have to go crazy, so you don't need to add like an ARIA label to every single element in your site. But if, say, you have a table that contains data in it, you might want to add an ARIA label about the table, that the data contained in the table. Or if you have a navigation system, you might want to add an ARIA label with a title for the navigation. ARIA labeled by is a cool sort of thing that you can use in lieu of ARIA labels, so you're not like copying the same content over. So say your navigation system has a heading, you could put in the ARIA labeled by the ID to that heading if the heading has an ID, and you could add like a little word. So like say you have a section navigation we're in your academics web section of your website, and the navigation already has like the academics heading, you could grab that and append like academics section navigation. So like you could kind of make it a variable for when you're going through your pages, that first part would update depending on what's in the top of the navigation. You can string together multiple IDs, so you could reference like multiple different sections of your website to include as an ARIA label. See, ARIA has pop-up. This is great for if you do have navigation systems that like when you hover or click on a link, it has like additional, big menu pop-up. You could include has pop-up on there. ARIA described by, this is for longer text, so it's very similar to ARIA label, but if you want to provide more context than just a short snippet, ARIA described by is a great example. So I think of this as if you're including a graphic of a flyer or something on your website, you might want to have ARIA described by and have all of the details that are in that flyer. I have a link to the sort of beginner-friendly list of ARIA properties. I think this A11Y project website is really awesome, especially for beginners who don't want to be overwhelmed. It's broken up really well. So that brings us to states. States are more dynamic than properties. States are updated via JavaScript as users interact with the content on the web page. It's worth noting that this requires programming. So it's not automatically updated just because you click on something. It doesn't automatically get selected. You have to add that programming in. If you are familiar with the JavaScripts on your page, it might not be too hard for you to go through and find the lines where, say, you on click something pops up. You could go to that function and add a line of code to add that the state is changing something from hidden to visible, and then that content would be announced. So I would say this would be like kind of the next level that you would go to once you have your roles and your properties built out on your web page. You could start dabbling in the JavaScripts that exist on your website and incorporating states and changing the state depending on what's happening within your website. Screen readers identify changes in states and announce them to the users. There are 10 states that can be used in ARIA. Sorry. States are divided into 3 categories by W3C. Currently, there's 8 widget states, 1 live region state, and 1 drag and drop state. So you'll most likely, working on a website, be concerned with the 8 widget states. So these are our different widget states that I have all 8 documented. I just have the first 5 here. But ARIA checked. So this would be if you're using an unconventional item for a form. I recently worked with a client, well, recently, probably a year ago, where they were using some weird JavaScript library that took these elements, I think they were divs, and converted them into checkboxes, which was not the best practice, but I was working with what I was given, and so I would add ARIA checked because the scope of the project deemed that I wasn't allowed to change what they had done, so I just had to incorporate, something to make it more accessible. ARIA current, this is a great sort of state for, say, you're having a calendar and you want somebody to be able to jump to, say, the current date being marked. You can have that. So ARIA current can also be used if you have a navigation system and you want to mark the current page in the navigation system so they know that that link is essentially just going to refresh the page. Ideally, maybe you wouldn't have that link linked, but we work with what we got sometimes, and sometimes it's just easier to add the ARIA current than to redo the CSS to make it so that the page we're on in the list looks the same or is resemblant and doesn't lose the padding and all of that. So those are all sorts of things I run into when working with other people's code, and by using ARIA, I'm able to add on to it to make it more accessible than what it was. ARIA disabled, this is great with making an element as visible but not interactive. So you could even disable that link to make it so that people aren't trying to click on it. ARIA expanded, this is really useful for if you're doing those accordions. You could add this line to the code that expands the accordion panel or the tab panel, and you could say, ARIA expanded. ARIA hidden. The element is hidden to all users, including those using assistive technology. So this is a little confusing how it's written. ARIA hidden doesn't actually hide the element from people who are looking at the website. It will hide it from people who are using a screen reader. So a lot of times ARIA hidden can be used if you're using icons that really, there's a text alternative you're providing to the screen reader. You could add ARIA hidden to the icon and provide just the text label to the people using the screen reader, so it's not redundant. ARIA invalid, this is good for if you have forms and validation. ARIA pressed and ARIA selected are pretty similar. Pressed is for a button. And selected is, if you have that tab or the accordion, you might want to have the element that triggered the expansion or the opening, have it say ARIA selected. So I kind of covered this a little bit already, but where and how do you recommend starting with ARIA? Mark up your page with landmarks. Divide each area of your page into banner, main, complementary, and content info to start. Then from there, add other landmarks where it makes sense. So specifically navigation and any additional regions that you think make sense to give somebody a landing point for. Start adding the labels where it makes sense. Start relating the data from, elements to other elements. And then if you're using JavaScript to manipulate your content display on the page and you understand the JavaScript, assess where you can add ARIA states. So these are the resources I used when I first started learning ARIA. I think Mozilla is a great website for documentation of this. There is, the W3C, you can use that. It's very technical though, and I get lost in the tables, to be completely honest. So I don't suggest starting there. I think that's a great place to go to reference something what you're wanting to learn more about, but I wouldn't recommend just sitting down and reading the page because it's a lot. So I went kind of fast, but I wanted to include this last slide on here since it's right before lunchtime. I like fun conversations about accessibility and web development. What are some fun conversation starters? One would be, and let me see if I have a slide for this. Yes. Should I use role equals menu or role equals navigation? I've seen role equals menu quite a bit recently in other people's websites, and the answer is 99% of the time navigation is the way to go. By using role equals menu, you're telling the website or the screen reader that you're going to be providing keyboard shortcuts and that you will be overriding the potential built-in functionality that is already there. Role equals menu makes sense if you're doing an actual application where you would need to use shortcuts. So like things like if you're developing Slack or Facebook, then it may make sense to have a role equals menu. But if you're just talking about a regular website, role equals navigation is typically the way to go, and you should just have maybe a couple different navigation systems on your website with different labels to differentiate them. If you use role equals menu, you have to mark each menu item underneath it as a menu item as well. So that's like one of the things that I see in automated testing that like alerts me that somebody's using menu, is that most people who use menu don't use menu items under it, and that's like a no-no because it doesn't register that there's any menu items. So you kind of made your site less accessible. So that's a fun little fact to take away. And if you want to like look at other people's websites and point out their mistakes, that's a great place to start. But we don't like to highlight other people's mistakes typically unless they ask like what's going on. What's the difference between role none, role presentation, and ARIA hidden equals true? Role equals none and role equals presentation are the same thing. Role equals none was just developed more recently, and that's probably like 2 years ago. But it was hopefully, I think, done to eliminate some confusion about what presentation means. Role equals none and role equals presentation will still provide the content within the element to people using a screen reader, but it will basically make them think that the element was just for presentation. So hypothetically speaking, I've worked on people's websites who have their website still laid out as a table just because they don't have the resources to go through a redesign and to redo all of their pages. So in their case, they might want to go through that table and mark those table elements as role equals presentation. So the content is still there, but they don't think that the table is necessarily the reading flow of the page. I don't think that's like the best use case, but it's something that we're people who wear a lot of different hats, and sometimes you just have to start somewhere. ARIA hidden equals true. This means that the content will not be visible to a screen reader. It will be visible to people visiting just using a regular web browser. Display none has to be used to hide the content altogether from a sighted visitor. And at that point, you don't really need, if you use display none, it's the same as ARIA hidden equals true for people using a screen reader. So display none will hide it for people just using a regular browser and for people using a screen reader. So that's just something to keep in mind. There are points where I've pointed out where you would want to use ARIA hidden equals true. That would be where content might be redundant for a person using a screen reader because you might be providing an alternative way for them to see or to get the content. And then my last favorite conversation starter, just because I'm a troublemaker, is to alt text or not to alt text on a decorative image. Like I said, we do automated testing, so our automated testing picks up that alt text isn't on an image, and sometimes that's on purpose, and sometimes that's, you know, your universities or colleges standard is that if it's a presentation element, you put in the alt tag, but you leave it blank, and you mark it as role equals presentation. At the very least, you should definitely include role equals presentation or none. But with regard to alt text, when it's an image that's decorative, it's like, is it worse to have an image not load without alt text? Like say you have bandwidth issues and the images load as broken icon images, because that will still happen for sighted visitors. Do you want the alt text there, basically saying like image depicting, and you wouldn't want to include the word image, but our trust is, you know, worth 100 handshakes or something like that. So those are kind of like the three, you know, fun sort of conversations that you can have over lunch or bring back to your team and kind of develop policies specifically around the alt text. But the other two are just good to know and good takeaways on those things with a little more depth. So any questions? I kind of breezed through really quickly. Or thoughts? Back?
So a lot of these roles, like you said, have HTML5 components, things like footer, header, sections. What do you have any good resources for taking, say, like a 20-year-old application that has maybe not really needed to change functionally, but now needs to be accessible, and taking that and applying the new HTML5 elements for it? Would you recommend doing that, or just adding the role elements to something that might be that old?
I'd say it depends on your level of expertise on CSS and JavaScript. If you can convert the elements and you can do so and update the JavaScript and the CSS and the HTML, I would recommend doing that. Just because I'm more forward thinking and knowing that adding just the ARIA tags is like applying a Band-Aid. But if hypothetically you're going to be going through a redesign of that application later on, the Band-Aids are probably your best bet on effort. Or if you don't really understand what's going on in the JavaScript, you know, adding and changing that could have bad ramifications because you could be mistargeting something and breaking the application for everyone. So it really depends on how much time you have and what the future for it looks like. And I forgot to repeat the question. The question was whether to apply ARIA tags or to add HTML5 elements when updating an application that is maybe 5-10 years old. Is there another question? Yes?
You mentioned with the ARIA, I think it's another document with the ARIA is the ARIA authoring practices. With that, it covers using ARIA.
Okay, what was the name of that?
ARIA authoring practices.
ARIA authoring practices? I haven't looked at that, or maybe I haven't, I just don't know I have. But yeah, so Google ARIA authoring practices for more information on ARIA documentation.
There's also that group is also working on assistive technology, how we can use for ATM browsers and stuff.
Yeah, and ATMs are a fun thing to see, the technology that's really old that has never actually met accessibility. Like they sometimes have the headphone jack, but yesterday I was at the airport. There was no place for a wheelchair to go under the ATM. I don't think there was even a headphone jack, but they've added Braille, even though most people who are even blind don't know Braille, which is kind of an interesting thing to know as well. But yeah, thank you. There was one more or no?
Are there any issues with landlords being manifested inside of each other?
The first ones there are a few that aren't supposed to be nested, and those were, so nesting landmarks is okay for the most part, but there are some top level ones that you're not supposed to do that with. So I believe main can be nested, but you would want to have complementary content info be top level roles. That's my understanding. And banner. Yes. Yes, I've already sent them. I've already sent the slides to the higher beings, so they should be available somewhere on the Summit website.
There will be a slide link on the schedule, as well as a feedback link. Any other questions?
So I was recently tasked with building a CSS navigation for a third-party skinned site
Mhm.
for grammar accessibility. And so obviously with CSS only, you can't have the ARIA expanded properties on your own navigation. So I'm curious, like how bad that is for them. Is there something in the WCAG, however you want to pronounce that, specification that requires that you use ARIA expanded, or is that just like extra? It's extra helpful.
I would venture to say it's extra helpful. I would say that there needs to be some sort of connection between the thing that's expanding and what you're clicking on, I assume. And that could be handled through making it well structured, like making the list within the list item so people know that that goes down. So really making sure you have the HTML core correctly set up so that there is like a way to follow it.
Yeah, you can navigate through it with the keyboard just fine. There's a few parts of it like where to keep the same look, I know that I have a close button for mobile navigation like in two places, which is not super great, but you can navigate.
Yeah, I guess like for me, like the concern there is just making sure that the focus goes somewhere that it makes sense once they hit that close button.
Right, yeah. Although I think you have to go through everything again, because I can't change the tab index or anything. In the close button, there's a row.
That's a more complex one. I'd have to look at it to give a suggestion. Yeah, I mean, we are going through a redesign of our interface, and the moment somebody like sent us a design with overlay, I was like, please, no overlays, because it's just a nightmare to keep track of like where the button should go, and also just if you're not a sighted user, it just makes things a lot more complicated. And I'm a minimalist, so it works out better for me not to have overlays.
Thank you, Penny. Very good. Remember to visit the schedule page. There will be a feedback button
Is that okay?
and slides.
I was like,
download
I
button.
just now looked at it.